Sorry everyone, I'm just giving you a holding statement as we are having a slight technical hitch. Our first of the day, so that's I think, and we've had to go for a new laptop because they're not speaking. So at least, in the other tent they may be fighting, our projector and the laptop aren't speaking. But we will rectify it as soon as possible and we'll get cracking with the talk. So thank you for your patience. Talk amongst yourselves. So now that our technical genius is back, I'm going to confidently assume that we'll be up and running in about 1 minute. So I'm going to introduce Dominic. We've got two great lectures coming up here in the next 2 hours. So thank you for joining us. There will be a break between the two if people want to have a comfort stop. So I'm going to introduce Dominic. I think for many of you he won't need an introduction. You may know him from his writings in the Daily Telegraph, where he writes on this day. You may know him from the many television programmes that he's been involved in, or indeed from the many books that he's published. Today he's going to speak for us on the Knights Templar. So Dominic, thank you, and I'm sure we're seconds away. Look at that for timing.
Great, well thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you all for coming and for bearing with us while we get the IT ready. You'll all know from Umberto Eco that the world is divided into 4 different categories of people. There are fools, morons, cretins and lunatics. And the way you can tell a lunatic is from their lack of engagement with reality, from their flashes of inspiration, and from the fact that sooner or later they all start talking about the Templars. So I know I'm in good company today because you've all paid to be here. So let's look at the Templars in Ireland. Unlike some of the other talks going on here today, where there's mainly discussions about rebellion and revolution, I can't give you those, but what I can give you is what was alluded to in the opening speech last night, which is a lot of focus on antagonism, conflict, bitterness and religious strife. So, Templars. When we think of the Templars, what sort of image comes to our mind these days? And the answer is it's quite a complex identity that they now have. There's certainly violence, there's certainly intolerance, and these are just some of the images that I picked off that one finds on the internet these days. In the first instance, we've got this famous image of the knight in the bottom left. Then we have next to him Donald Trump. Then we've got some... who's there? Oh yes, Anders Breivik. Then a patch that some people like wearing, a Crusader patch on your shield or with your shield or on your shield. Then top right, this was a US military base in Hawaii where they used the Templar logo on their sign outside the base but were required to remove it because it was too inciting of discord. Then in the middle we've got the English Defence League, whom you might know, but they're a fairly extremist white supremacist group in England. And then in the top left, we have possibly my favourite, because he's even wearing the helmet. I'd put him in about mid-13th century. He's a drug cartel warlord from Mexico, and they have a group called the Knights Templar, and they even have a full rule, like the monastic rule book. And they're some of the best dressed these days. So citing the Templars into the historical context of military and religious orders, there are many that were copycats. And some which evolved at around the same time, but no one did it quite the way the Templars did, and they remain iconic in the modern imagination. I've just pulled off a few here. The Order of the Holy Sepulchre in the top left, they have the Jerusalem Cross, possibly one of the groups from which the Templars were founded, but we might get into that later. The Order of Malta, of course, still with us, the Knights of Malta, again co-evolved with the Templars. They existed before the Templars, but they didn't become military till after the Templars. In Spain, it became a very popular idea to have military and crusading orders because of the reconquest going on there. So we have the Knights of Calatrava, bottom left. And then bottom right, we've got the Order of St. Thomas of Acre, which is an English order that was set up in Acre in the Holy Land. In the middle, of course, we have the Teutonic Knights, whose iconography is still very present in the 20th and 21st century. And in the top right, we've got a German order, the Schwertbrüderorden, the Sword Brothers. But for all of them, really, in one way or another, they took the Templars as their model. And they took this idea of having a monastic order that was also a chivalric order, so fusing the two quite distinct medieval professions of knight and monk and making one dangerous, religiously focused warrior out of them. First thing to remember about the Crusaders is they didn't call themselves Crusaders. That's a word that we call them. The Crusaders called themselves pilgrims. And they lived in a very religiously charged atmosphere. And when you think of things like the Mappa Mundi and other medieval world maps, you'll remember that Jerusalem is always shown at the centre of the world in medieval maps. So this is a song that was written by a French priest close to the time of the First Crusade. And it just gives you an idea of the sort of language that they were using and the thoughts that they were having as to why they were going on this crusade, what it was about. We may now think of it in terms of economics or colonization or military reasons or political reasons, but for the people who were on it, certainly from the legacy that we're left, that we know about it, there was a very, very strong spiritual element to it. Quick reminder, the Crusades really fall into two very distinct periods. From when they begin at the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II launches the crusade, you then get a couple of years for mobilisation, and then the Crusaders take Jerusalem. And they cover all the area that's grey on this map. What happens then in 1187 is cataclysmic. Saladin arrives, Jerusalem is lost, it's to a large extent the fault of the Templars, we'll come on to that. And then for the second period of the Crusades, only that much narrower band is held by the Crusaders. And so that second 100 years, it's almost a 100-year and a 100-year split, is really lamenting the loss of Jerusalem, trying to take it back again. But actually they've stirred up so much rancour and antagonism in the Islamic rulers around the fringe of where they are. From when they started, they weren't united at all, and they weren't able to prevent any kind of obstacle to Crusaders. But after 1187 they're getting much more united, and really the second half of the Crusades is all about just trying to cling on with their fingernails to the land that they've still got. So the origins of the Templars, sadly for the fans of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, or the fans of Dan Brown, there's no Priory of Zion, there's no cutting of any elm at Gisors or anywhere else. There's a very, very well-written, well-known, fully documented beginning and origin for this order. What's happened is that after the First Crusaders succeeded so spectacularly in 1099, most people have gone home again. Those who got lands kept lands, and they're very pleased to have them, but the vast majority went home. So the Holy Land is left very under-resourced, undermanned, under-defended. So as a result, they start losing battles. There's a lot of skirmishing going on, there are a lot of guerrilla campaigns against the early Crusaders, and they realise that they simply don't have the manpower to protect the land that they've got. Then in 1118, at Easter, in the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, and still now today, they have a big ceremony called the Ceremony of the Holy Fire. The fire comes down, the church is in darkness, they bring the fire out of the Holy Sepulchre, they light the candles are taken all over Jerusalem, it's relit. It's a very, very moving ceremony. After this, in 1118, about 500 pilgrims decided to go down to the River Jordan to give thanks and to bathe, and while they were there was a massacre, and the vast majority of them were slaughtered. So the Crusaders realised that things couldn't go on as they were, and there was a problem. So they held a council at Nablus, which of course still exists, in 1120 in January. And at that council they brought in lots of laws, because they thought to themselves the reason this was happening was God was displeased with them. They were obviously not behaving themselves properly. So all these laws they passed, and if you get the chance, search them up on Google. I'm not going to go through them here because they're not for a family audience. But essentially they're to do with the Crusaders' morality. And they think the problem is that they're allowing all sorts of relations to develop between Crusaders and locals, local Byzantine Christians, and also local Muslims. And there are different penalties depending on whether you're a man, you're a woman, you're a priest, whether it's heterosexual, whether it's homosexual. It's actually one of the first great canons of sexual criminalised legislation that we know of in the West. But at the end of that council, a man called Hugh of Pains, who was the founder of the Templars, stood up and said, I've got this great idea, I've been working with this knights, can we please form together with your blessing and defend the pilgrim ways? And that's the first we really know about them. Clearly a lot had been happening before then for them to have got to that stage. Different sources say different things, but the earliest source, which is a Syrian source, says that there were probably around 30 of them to begin with. In later times, they liked this myth that there were 5, 7 or 9, but 30 seems the earliest that we know of. Now, just for iconography, if this is fun, people often try to, as we saw in the early symbols, use Templar symbols and Templar crosses. This is the correct Templar iconography. The banner is black over white, argento, schefter, sable. The standard is called the Baucan, B-A-U-C-A-N. You'll see it's spelt all sorts of different ways in more modern texts, but that's the earliest spelling that we have of it. And Baucan is a French word. It simply means piebald, because it's a piebald banner. There were two main classes of people within the Templars. There were the knights, they were the minority. You had to be nobly born and you had to already be knighted before you could become a Templar. And then there were the sergeants. And some of the sergeants were mounted, so they also fulfilled a cavalry role. Some were on foot, and so they were an infantry role. But those were the two main fighting elements. There were plenty of others. We'll look at some of them. But those were the main combat units of the order. So on the left we have a sergeant. This is from Perugia. You can see that, like knights, he's bearded. All Templars had long beards and short hair. You can see that he's carrying the white and black and the red cross, as we saw. And then on the right you can see, this is Matthew Paris's depiction of the two knights. It's very famous. We also see it on their seal. Nobody really knows why there are two knights, and they invented their own stories as to why there are. But they're all part of myth-making and symbolism rather than necessarily historically factual. Some say it's to reflect their poverty. It's very unlikely that they were poor in the early stages. Others say it's much more about fraternity. So what does it mean to be a Templar in Ireland or anywhere else? Well, of course, those who were in the Holy Land focused on fighting, but even then it wasn't for all of the time. It was only for a number of the years. Less than 20% of actually the 200 years they were in the Holy Land. For the rest of the time they were trading, they were communicating, they were learning, they were mixing. But at the heart of their life was the religious day and was the daily office. The daily office, of course, varied between different monastic orders in medieval times, and also between monastic orders and secular church orders, and the cathedrals and the churches, and the various orders of canons. This is the Templar Day. This is the way they did it. We know this from their rule. And what, of course, we always have to remember with the medieval day is they divided the day into 12 units. Each unit is an hour. But that division went into daylight hours. So in winter, the days were much shorter than in summer, when the hours were much longer. So it's an elastic concept of units of 12 within a day. Templars were literate. We have records. Some of them were lawyers, some of them spoke Arabic. This one, a Provençal one, liked to write poetry. And this was written in the late 13th century, just despairing at the ongoing loss of land. And you can read in the language that he's using, the sort of pain and passion that he's feeling at the futility and the pointlessness of the task that he seems to be set. And at the bottom, this is from a very famous map, not the Hereford map, but this is a map that's currently in Amsterdam, and it shows St. George, but he's wearing Templar iconography. He's wearing the Templar Red Cross. Now, I'm going to go quickly through this. Templars, as monks, took the traditional monastic vows. And we have a very early set of what those vows were, so we know exactly the individual vows a Templar had to make. So I've got a couple of slides of these, and I'm going to run through them really quickly for you. So, the traditional monastic vows. Now, good brother, we hear well what you have asked of us. You promise to God and to Our Lady that you will, all the days of your life, remain obedient to the Master of the Temple. Also, you promise to God and to Our Lady Mary that you will, for all the days of your life, live chastely in your body. And thirdly, you promise to God and to Our Lady Mary that you, all the days of your life, will live without property. Then this is a specifically Templar vow, so this you won't find in ordinary monastic orders. Also, you promise to God and to Lady St. Mary that you, all the days of your life, will help to conquer, with all the strength and power that God has given you, the holy territory of Jerusalem. Also, you'll promise to God and to Lady St. Mary that never will you leave this religious order for a stronger or a weaker one, or a richer or a worse or a better one. And also you promise to God and to Lady St. Mary that you will never be in a place or in a situation where a Christian person will be deprived of his property. Here's another one they took. Good lords. So he's talking now to the whole chapter, which is where they made their professions. Stand up, please, and pray to our Lord and to Lady St. Mary that this one will do well. But firstly, we ask of you, have you ever had a wife, or have you been engaged? Second is, have you ever been in any other religious order? The third is, have you ever had any owed any debt to any man or to the world? The fourth is, if you are healthy in your body. The fifth is if you have promised or given to any man of the world or any brother of the temple anything in either money or other thing which is to help you enter the order. So that's the sin of simony, buying religious office through consideration. Or if you've ever been the serf of any man. And then finally they're received into the order. The person conducting the ceremony says, and we, by the grace of God and by Our Lady St. Mary and by our Lord St. Peter in Rome and by our Apostolic Father and by all the brothers of the temple, we welcome you into the goods, the benefits of the house, which have been given from the beginning of time and which will continue to be given till the end of time. And what they mean by those goods of the house is a very important thing. It was actually one of the main reasons why many people became Templars or became associated with the Templar Order, because the benefits of the house means the purgatorial prayers that people have said up until then and will continue to say, the right to burial in their cemetery, and so the ongoing benefits, they're spiritual benefits rather than temporal benefits. But in the medieval world, when purgatory was becoming a large focus at this time, that was a very significant draw, we know from reading the charters that people wrote when they joined, as to why they joined. Right, in Ireland. So the first thing, which is a bit disappointing, is that Irish Templars are part of the province of England. There are 8 Templar provinces. They change a little over time, but effectively they run very large geographical units. So there was a master or a preceptor in Ireland, but he was appointed by the general chapter in London in the temple. The first activity we know of them follows Henry II and the Norman invasion of Ireland. They're not part of that invasion. There's no evidence they had anything to do with Strongbow or with Henry or came over in the invading forces. But in the aftermath of that invasion, we see the Templars begin to settle. And the first instance is sometime between 1172 and 1177. We see a grant from King Henry of certain lands, including Clontarf in Dublin. Then in 1177 we have Matthew the Templar. He appears as witnesses to a charter. And then in 1180 we have Walter, the master of the temple, who has quite a career. We see him a lot in the documentation. And he appears alongside a charter with Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, who, as you know, is a very famous chronicler. Now, this is my map. You may have a better one. I've put this together from the sources that I'm aware of. But what immediately strikes you is that they really are clinging to the east and the south and the Norman areas. What is not on this map, and which is probably as much more interesting work, and maybe somebody is doing it, is that the Templars had very pyramid-like structures when they moved somewhere. So they would have the main commandery, which is what you would be used to seeing if you went around the ruins, which is the chapel and the refectory and the dormitory and their buildings and the stables. But behind that, supporting it, they had granges, and each commandery often ran hundreds of granges. So you could find dotted all over the countryside much smaller agricultural units that may only just be a couple of serving brothers, and they're looking after some fields or they're looking after a certain amount of livestock. But they'll report back to the central commandery, and mapping those is something that's been done in some territories. It hasn't yet been done in Ireland, but we may well see that map actually looks much more well dispersed over Ireland than just looking at the commanderies might suggest. Another thing that the conspiracy theorists love to tell us is that we have no idea how the Templars got so rich. They must have dug something up from under Jerusalem. They must have met with aliens. They must have discovered Mary Magdalene. They have to have been blackmailing the Pope. Actually, their wealth is very, very easily explicable. They were highly commercially savvy, and they extracted very, very meaningful privileges. Medieval world economically was highly regulated. People had only certain times when they could sell their goods and produce. There were tax and tithes they had to pay on them. The Templars were exempt from almost all of that. From 1139, from their first papal acknowledgement, they had the right to sell their goods when they felt like it, where they felt like it, without paying any taxes. That already is a massive game changer and will elevate any order in the 1100s and 1200s to economic prosperity. On top of that, they had another very real privilege, which they were allowed to go around any church in Christendom and open it up, say Mass, and raise a collection for themselves and the Holy Land, even if that church was interdicted. This caused a massive amount of friction with the local clergy, as you can imagine, because they weren't, and their livelihood was effectively suspended while the interdict was in place, and the Templars would come riding in and have a big festival and raise lots of money. And so a great deal of the information we get about the Templars in the medieval time is actually from this conflict, from litigation with the regular clergy, with the Templars riding in and, in their view, trampling on their existing privileges. But when you start aggregating those ways of raising money, you'll understand why the Templars were so much richer than everybody else. It doesn't take some extraordinary explanation that no one's yet heard of. In addition to which, they built on that. Once they had reserves of money, they developed very clever financial products. They would mortgage someone's land so that person could go off on crusade to Jerusalem. They would provide the shipping and the transport and funding for the person while they went on crusade. You could deposit your goods here in the West, you could pick them up in Jerusalem or Acre. They invented international checking accounts, effectively. When you came back from crusade, hopefully, your land was in very good shape because they looked after it, because they were professional farmers. They kept all the produce while you were away that they'd managed to garner, but it was a good deal for you because your land was in good state. If, however, you died, the land went to the Templars. It happened fairly often. So when you're thinking about the donations that they got, pious donations, you have to add on top of that these kind of financial arrangements they entered into, which also netted them a huge amount of wealth. They didn't leave the land fallow and stagnant. They farmed it and they made money from it. Again, another great source of income for them. So eventually you have them, the equivalent of Goldman Sachs, the Navy SEALs. I mean, they combine all these roles into one in one order. And it's not surprising that they become both very successful and also very controversial. So, Templar Masters in Ireland, the ones we know of, what you'll immediately note from this is that the names are not very Irish. And this is interesting because in most places where the Templars went, they followed a Cistercian model, which was to recruit people locally. So they would send a couple of brothers into an area, they would encourage them to mix and talk to the local minor nobility. It normally was not major nobility, minor nobility, and they would encourage them to become brothers, to found a new commandery and to start a community. And then all of their wider relatives would come in, give donations, and it would grow in that way. But that's not what's happening in Ireland. It's very clearly these are Anglo-Norman names. Southwark, Glastonbury, Toulouse, and we see in the records these people being appointed from the Grand Chapter in London, so we know that's how it's being done. Two masters worth mentioning. Again, records don't tell us, a bit like the news today, they don't tell us the good news, they don't tell us the bad news. So these are two who are in trouble, both of them for corruption. Ralph of Southwark, who was accused of corruption, and he was forced to give up his habit, and he was exiled, and he wasn't allowed to return to the British Isles or Ireland, and if he did, he'd be arrested. And the second one, Walter Batchelor, very unfortunately, he was tried by the General Chapter and put in the penitential cell in the Temple in London. I don't know if any of you have been there, but if you do, ask one of the sacristans or vergers or warders to show it to you. It's on the rotunda, but there's a staircase going up, and you can go up the staircase, and then there's a very small cell. It really couldn't have been very comfortable being in there, and there are just two slits from which you can look down into the main body of the church, so you can hear Mass. But this poor chap was left in the cell, and he died in the cell. And when the Inquisition came to look into the Templars, not many years later, they were absolutely fixated on this death. They really wanted to pin this on the Templars as an act of gross misconduct. They weren't able to and didn't, although in the modern mind it probably was an act of gross misconduct. But that's how we know about that. We do get some Irish names. In the plea rolls of Edward I, there's one with a list of, these people are called as servientes. So if you imagine a Templar commandery, you've got the knights, you've got the sergeants, you've got the familia, the wider people who are associated with them, confraters and consorors, people in ordinary life who joined them, a bit like being a Dominican or a Franciscan tertiary. But you also had the servientes, and they were effectively the people who made things happen. They were the people who made it work. They were the servants. And so there we see all of those names, and those are indisputably Irish names. But that's one of the only times when we see at that level of granularity inside a Templar commandery the ethnic and the demographic makeup of who's there. The Irish, of course, did go on crusade. This is from a 16th century poem, an Italian poem. It may not be massively accurate, it's possibly not very flattering, but it's worth knowing that, you know, in many of the sources there are references to Irish contingents in the Crusades. Right, the Templars came to a very sticky end, as we all know. They were the subject of a vast and infamous political show trial. It was a huge battle between royal power and papal power, and Philip of France wanting royal power to come into the ascendancy. He wanted to be the main power in Europe, and resulting in one of the sort of most infamous miscarriages of justice. So in the final years, as we know, in 1307, the Templars were arrested all over France. Then we know that the Pope, even though he didn't want to initially, then effectively took over the process, hoping to control it, but failing spectacularly. Edward in England wasn't interested, thought it was all trumped up, didn't buy it, wrote to all the other heads of Europe and said, don't pay any attention to this. But eventually he was forced to come into line. And then the major landmarks, of course, are the burning of the 54 Templars in Paris in 1310, then the suppression of the order in 1312, never officially condemned, but simply closed down as being too reputationally damaged. And then all of the goods being handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, having paid Philip off for his very pious troubles in bringing this scandalous matter to the attention of Christendom and the Pope. And then, of course, on the death pyre there is Jacques de Molay's very famous curse, saying that he wants to see the Pope and the King in heaven to be judged by God before the year is out, and of course both die before the year is out, and this helps the legend of Jacques de Molay. Sadly, that curse only appears several centuries later, no doubt because everybody knew the King and the Pope had died within the year. The accusations against them, very famous. Over 100 of them, but they're really grouped into categories of deviance, and they're mainly religious deviance in terms of their orthodoxy and sexual deviance. The really interesting question is why people believed them, because they're pretty ridiculous claims, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The Templars were widely disliked by many people in power, and it was possible to take small elements of mispractice within the order, which of course there were, fan the flames and present the order as being rotten from top to bottom. And it's something we see happening these days. It was something that happened then. It's not uncommon, but on the scale on which it happens at Templars, it's possibly one of the first some major examples of a massive spin exercise. And it was very effective. It lasted for centuries. It's only really very recently that people have started rehabilitating the Templars. In Ireland, they were arrested. King Edward II sent his orders to his seneschal in Ireland, and they were brought in on the 3rd of February 1308. Inventories were done of some of their properties. What you'll find around the rest of Europe at the time of the arrests is that there aren't really many knights. Most of the knights are still off in Cyprus, which is then their headquarters because they've lost the Holy Land. There are just some old wounded knights hanging around. There are sergeants, and there are a lot of farm labourers. We see that in terms of the wealth, there's really not very much. Certainly in the rural commanderies, these are some of the more exceptional things that are found, but they're interesting because they're exceptions, not the norm. The cloth is interesting. There's a suggestion that they may have been heavily involved in cloth manufacture in one of the commanderies. But on the whole, the commanderies seem to have been really fairly humble. And they were all taken, they were incarcerated in Dublin Castle. These are the names we've got of the brothers who were arrested, and it's very few. There are a great number who are missing. So as everywhere else in Europe, a lot of them had done a runner before the arrests came. Certainly in Ireland, they had lots of notice. They'd seen what had been going on in France and England for a long time. The distressing element is those with asterisks by them. They're arrested, but they never appear at the trial and they never feature again, so they almost certainly died in custody. The questioning of the Templars was carried out normally by the local bishops acting under papal and episcopal councils, but at one stage it was handed over to the Inquisition. The Inquisition has never set foot in Britain or Ireland historically. because of the types of justice systems of oppositional justice as opposed to inquisitorial judge-led justice. It's just something that never happened. However, the trial of the Templars was the one and only occasion the Inquisition ever appeared. They went to London, they asked for permission to torture the Templars. Edward refused. They came up with the idea of rendition, like we've seen recently. They wanted to take them to Ponthieu in France, which was technically under the jurisdiction of the English king, but French law applied, because they thought they'd be able to get away with torturing them there. King Edward refused. In Ireland, they weren't tortured, and the Inquisition lead people from London did not come over, but they appointed local representatives, and you can see their names there. So of all of those Templars that we saw originally, 14 were questioned, and we have 41 witnesses were brought against them, and they were each asked, the Templars were interrogated 3 times, with 87 sets of questions each against them. The accusations were very feeble. Here's one example of an accusation. Most of the accusers of the Templars, and this is true over all of Christendom, were other religious orders. And we spoke earlier about some of the animosity that the religious orders had towards them. I mean, this is one of the ways that comes out. The accusations were not particularly strong, as you can see. There are some other very famous ones you'll have seen, not from Ireland, but incredibly intense outpourings about how some washerwoman washed some Templar's underwear and found a cross stitched into his pants in a very unseemly place. And I mean, this was the level of the horrors that people were bringing forward. So it's not surprising that here in Ireland there were no convictions. And it's also relevant that there was no torture. If one looks globally, only in areas where there was torture and where they were under the authority of Philip of France were there confessions. In the public imagination, it did stick that the Templars were guilty after they were suppressed, because there was no defence that they were able to put out. So you can see here from the Book of Health, which is Irish in 16th century, there is still this idea that Philip and the Church had undertaken a cleansing and a purifying act by removing the Templars from the world. So were they guilty? Were they or were they not guilty? This is possibly the most interesting document in modern Templar studies. This is called the Shino parchment. Now we knew this existed because we had records of it, but we didn't have it. We now have it. This was discovered in the Vatican Secret Archives not very long ago. And what this is a confession by the Master of the Temple and 2 of his senior lieutenants to a certain amount of impropriety. And this is done without torture in Chinon Castle. This is a private confession, effectively, to some apostolic legates that were sent, cardinals, to go and see them and to get the story, to take it straight back to the Pope. And they all 3 agreed and said there was no homosexuality, there were no idols, there were no black masses, there was no black magic. But what there was during the Templars' initiation ceremony, new recruits were asked to deny Christ and to spit on a cross or a crucifix, or an image of a cross or a crucifix. And they give examples of it, and they say it was done to them, and they say they did it to other people when they initiated them into the order. They were asked why they did this, and they said, we honestly can't remember, it's always been done this way. Maybe it was some psychological preparation for capture by the enemy, to see how people would deal with that kind of request. There was one suggestion that a previous Master of the Templars centuries earlier had been captured, and one of the conditions of his release was that he put this custom into place within the order, but nobody actually really knew. That, however, does appear to be true, and we have it from other sources as well. So Philip, the chances are, almost certainly got wind of this or something like this and took it and fanned what was a small spark of irregularity into something that was much greater. And when you read all of the accounts of how the Templars reacted to this, when this was done to them in their initiation ceremonies, most of them are horrified, refuse to do it, or the initiator says to them, listen, I'm going to put my hand over the cross, just say the words but don't mean it, spit on my hand, it's just something you need to get through. Were they heretics? Now, this is one of my favourite images. This is a Templar seal, and this shows a character called Abraxas. And Abraxas was around in the 2nd or 3rd century, particularly in Egypt. He was very well known, and he is a Gnostic deity. The Gnostics had this incredible pantheon of deities and astrological and zodiacal deities. Abraxas is a very well-known one. He's got cock's feet, no, he's got serpent's feet, he's got a cockerel's head, he carries a whip, he's got 7 stars, he's got the Alpha, he's got the Omega, and around him it says Secretum Templi, which just means the private thing of the Templars. Secretum is private, like the Vatican's secret archives. It belongs to the Pope. It doesn't necessarily mean it's secret. But this begs a huge question. What is a medieval Catholic religious order doing with this on their seal? Because you do not see this on any other religious order, kind of then, now, before or since. So some part of the Templars was doing something a bit odd. But we don't really know much more than that. But if ever you need any evidence to say, well, the Templars were doing some vaguely funny things, we do know their reception ceremony was odd, and we do know that this seal is not explicable in terms of Orthodox Christianity. A full inventory was done at the trial in Ireland, and this is just interesting in terms of where there was wealth, and there wasn't very much wealth, but where there was wealth, we see it particularly in livestock and particularly in grain. And in terms of livestock, one of the things that comes across very strongly is horses. There seem to be a huge number of horses in Irish commanderies. And we know that commanderies around Europe are used for raising money, manpower, weapons, horses, all the things they need to put onto the Templar fleet and sail over to the Holy Land in order to engage in the Crusades over there. And even today one understands about the logistics of fighting a war thousands of miles away. One of the reasons for the Templar success was they had this iceberg type structure with just the very few fighting over in the Holy Land and this vast network in Europe creating, building, preparing. And so Ireland seems to have been one of the homes for their horses. Every knight was entitled to 3 horses. Templars are very proud of their horses, and that seems to have been a strong contribution from Irish Templars. Right, I've tried to pull together some Templar sites in Ireland for you, and now I'm in your hands. You know more about this than I do. This isn't something that I've looked at on the ground. I've spent one extremely happy week in west of Ireland, so I haven't seen a single Templar commandery. But you'll know better than me. But these are the ones that I'm aware of from some of the sources. But correct me if you think any of these are wrong. So Clontarf Castle we do know about because we know that King Henry II gave it to them back in the 1170s. Although the commander of Ireland, the Templar commander of Ireland, didn't seem to have an HQ, he was fairly peripatetic. If there was one, this was it. Dublin Castle, not a Templar property, but somewhere where they were incarcerated. Don't know if anyone knows anything of that one. It's interesting that you'll often read in the books that certainly in places like England, when you find temple in a place name, it's an indication that it may well have been Templar. It may well not have been. There are plenty of people called Temple. There are plenty of other reasons for it to be called Temple. But there are many that are Temple. Temple Bar, Temple Gissingham, Temple Coombe. In Irish, of course, you have Teampull, which is church. And so the majority of historians say that does not indicate a Templar origin just because it says temple. It may well just be a Christian origin of another sort. Some people are vehement that every single one is Templar. You have to use your own judgment. There's another one in Limerick, Wexford, near Dublin, Sligo. So that's the furthest west. Right. So I hope in this short presentation that one of the things that's come across is that the Templars are not often what we think of them as being, and they're not what they're often portrayed as being in the popular media, like in those images by the Mexican drug cartels or by Dan Brown or by any of these other people. And this finally is another great example. This is the seal of the temple with the 2 knights on the 1 horse, and of course if you look round it you won't see the word Templar there anywhere. It says Sigillum Militum Christi, which means seal of the militia or the knighthood of Christ, and that's how they knew themselves. They were the knighthood of Christ. They very rarely called themselves Templars. So all is not always what it seems when it comes to the Templars. That's it. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Very quickly, some of the Templars, when the order was suppressed after some of them make their way into the Knights Hospitaller?
Globally, yes. Many went into the Knights Hospitaller, many were pensioned off into other monastic orders. Some who had confessed fully and then recanted, who were deemed to be relapsed heretics, were imprisoned for life. But yes, some went into hospital, and we do have records. If you look in hospitaller records, you'll see the chap's name, and you'll see Olim Templaris, formerly a Templar.
Earlier on in your lecture, you alluded to the early days of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I think it said that the Templars were in some way responsible for the disastrous campaign, that they lost most of the kingdom and retained this narrow strip along the seaboard here. Could you bring to that briefly?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I should have dealt with that. So, in the run-up to 1187, where the loss of Jerusalem, the step immediately before the loss of Jerusalem is a battle called the Battle of Hattin, which was possibly the most decisive battle of the Crusades. And the background to that was a split in the Crusader camp as to how to approach this particular engagement. And the Templars were on one side with the royal party, Guy of Lusignan. You'd have seen this in the film Kingdom of Heaven, the Ridley Scott, the brilliant film if you've seen it. And then on the other side, you had the Hospitallers and the comital house of Toulouse. And the story goes that the master of the Templars at the time was a chap called Gerard of Ridderford. When he'd arrived in the Holy Land just over a decade earlier, he'd hoped very much that Raymond was going to give him the hand of a beautiful young heiress called Lucia of Bertrand. And so he arrived thinking that his fortune was made. He wasn't a Templar at this stage, he was just a secular knight, and he thought he would have lots of lands and it would be much better than life back in France. But according to the story, and people doubt it, but it's the story in the Chronicles, Raymond didn't do that. He was persuaded by a local Italian merchant to put this poor lady on a set of scales, weigh her out in gold, and sold her to the Italian for her weight in gold. Gerard became incensed, joined the Templars, rose to be Templar Master, and so on the eve of the Battle of Hattin, he's opposite the table from Raymond, his old arch-nemesis, who didn't give him Lucia, and that is responsible for a certain amount of the antagonism in the royal camp in deciding which course of action to take. Gerard prevails, convinces the king that they should march out to the Horns of Hattin, where there's no water and there's no cover, and of course it's utterly disastrous, and they're all massacred, and then Jerusalem is lost in the weeks after that. So there was significant Templar involvement in undermining what wiser counsel was suggesting in terms of how to approach the engagement.
We've got lots of questions. Well, we go from the back first, so we do.
I was just wondering if you've given much thought to the fact that the Templars were the only knight class to come into Ireland who had a prohibition against killing Christians, and would that give them a special place in Ireland?
In terms of chivalry and knighthood generally, you're right that most damsels in distress were probably in distress because of knights, not because knights were helping them, as Hollywood would try to suggest. But over the course of the sort of 12th century, these ideas of chivalrous conduct start to take hold in some ways. And so other knights eventually, with the peace of God and the truce of God and ecclesiastical attempts to regulate this, would also have been started to come under pressure to behave themselves better. But you're right to indicate that for a long time they were the only ones who had this enhanced code of conduct.
Specifically that they could not kill the Christians, whilst the Irish were being repressed, I suppose, by the Norman society in general.
They didn't have a prohibition not to kill Christians. I mean, they killed each other.
Okay, I was actually wondering, was I even right? And that was the fact that they couldn't take lands from a Christian. Maybe that was where that confusion, where they say they couldn't kill a Christian. But even the fact that they couldn't take lands from a Christian would have given them a very unique position within Ireland at that time, I would. And I just wondering how you thought or explained that.
No, because I think it's generally a fairly lawless period anyway, and so the fact that people had aspirations doesn't mean they necessarily lived up to them. But it's true that they had a code and others didn't.
We have another question back there.
Yeah, you said that the legend was that there was 5, 7 or 9 brothers Templars. Is there any significance in those numbers?
Yes, I mean, they're all mystical numbers. Medievals loved playing with that kind of mysticism. They loved that kind of symbolism. We see it still in Neo-Templar orders and in Masonic orders. I mean, those numbers are, and have been for a very long time, symbolic. So they were picked up, and if you read the medieval chronicles, you see people playing with these numbers and explaining significance in different ways.
It's just that at an Irish wake, the number of candles, there was always an odd number.
Ah.
3, 5 or 7, so I was just wondering, helping us, why did they use an odd number of candles?
Interesting. I didn't know that.
We have another one here.
I'm just wondering, have you looked at the Brehon order and the jurisprudence in Ireland when the Templars came in, and how that fitted in with the jurisprudence here?
Right. No, I haven't, I'm afraid.
Right. There's a church up around Wexford-Kilkenny border that has a tomb and a statue of what's called a crusader, but
Right.
it's in that outfit.
Ah,
I don't know if you've seen that. It's full size.
right.
He's in
Stone.
Kilfane. He's a very tall
Yes,
knight.
yeah.
He's the Knight
Ah.
of Kilfane.
Ah,
He's
excellent.
absolutely beautiful.
Right.
So you have to go. There's another
Ah,
trick for
okay.
you.
There's one to look at. Thank you.
Sorry, that you valued the goods in Linar Scimmia, the Italian currency from Florence. Did they have the Knights Templar have a connection to Italy for this form of
Pounds, shillings, and pence
pound? Yeah,
is what it was. So,
That's
yeah, that's the currency here at the time.
but that was there at the time. It
Yes.
wasn't added on.
No, that was at that time. Yeah.
One more, and then we'll call it today.
To what extent did the suppression of the Templars coincide with the last of the Crusades? I know there were a number of Crusades, and I know the last couple of ones were, with a bunch of pirates going on.
Yeah, no, very good. It's exactly the same time, and there is a connection. The Crusaders lost the Holy Land in 1291, and after that they moved to. The Templars moved to Cyprus, so did the Knights of St. John for a bit, but then they moved to Rhodes and then Malta, and they were clever enough to stay out of Europe and build themselves a world and something to do. So, if you like, post-Crusade, they still had a function. One of the Templars' big problems, which made them vulnerable, is they didn't have a function after the Crusades. So they were trying to encourage people to create a new crusade and to think of trying to recapture the Holy Land again. But by then the world had really moved on. This was now the early 1300s, and it's the time of Marco Polo and Dante, and the Renaissance is coming, and people really aren't interested in knights in armour and castles anymore. Just technology and interests, and the intellectual world and current and climate in Europe had moved on as well. So they'd become outdated is probably the most brutal answer. And so yes, their fall coincided absolutely with the end of the Crusades.
Just one more.
Just in Mary's Bridget is another Templar site in Yoho.
Ah, thank you.
And there's Templar kind of insignia.
Thank you, I'll add it to my list.
Well, we had a lecture earlier, and we were talking about how castles lasted in Ireland for actually a very
Right.
long time. We were building them right up until the 1700s. So it would, at least the late 1600s, they could have come here. We would have had them. We had armour until then, So what a shame. What a missed opportunity for us.
Maybe they're still among us. You
Maybe
never
they're
know.
still here. And on that note, thank you to Dominic.
Thank you.
Please stay with us in the Secret Garden, because we're leaving Kingdom of Heaven and possibly a bit of Da Vinci Code, but we're moving on to Pirates of the Caribbean. Well, our Caribbean. So Pirates of the Westcott Coast in about 15 minutes' time. So please either come back to us, go and get refreshments and come back. We'd love to have you. Okay, thank you.